Hello, and welcome to Publisher Insights with Ingram, a quarterly series of broad thought leadership webinars on timely topics to further publisher knowledge and build upon publishing success. Today's panel discussion will focus on the health of today's publishing industry, where we'll dig into topics about challenges and macroeconomic conditions, bringing in multiple perspectives and viewpoints on the future of publishing. I'm Amy Cox-Williams, Vice President of Product and Merchandising at Ingram, and your moderator for today's discussion. Now, let's meet our panelists. I'm going to ask each to give a brief introduction, starting with Molly Stern.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Molly Stern. I'm the CEO and founder of Zando. I've been in publishing for many years, most of my adult life, over 25 years. I developed my skills as an editor at Penguin for 15 years, became the publisher, senior vice president publisher of Crown, where I launched imprints and published a range of books I'm incredibly proud of. But starting Zando has been an incredibly unique and powerful experience for me, and is intended to address, I think, a lot of systemic difficulty and media difficulty and discoverability difficulty. And I'm excited to share my insights and experience so far.
Thanks, Molly. Next, we'll go to Allison Hill.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, I'm Allison Hill, and I'm the CEO of the American Booksellers Association. I am a longtime bookseller. I worked for a couple of decades at Waterstones and Book Soup and Vroman's Bookstore, and then I moved into this position as the CEO of ABA March 2nd, 2020, so my timing was incredible. And I have had the great honor the last few years of working with our team to support independent bookstores around the country with their education, their advocacy, and their e-commerce, among other things.
Thanks, Allison. Next, Phil Ollila.
Hi, everybody. It's great to have so many book industry professionals and booksellers and librarians on the call. Hello to Molly, Allison, and Amy. It's great to see you, and I hope to see you in person soon. I'm Phil Ollila, and I run the business side of the Ingram Content Group. It includes our global wholesale, print, distribution, digital, and marketing businesses. At Ingram, our job is to deliver a suite of joined-up back-end services, sales and marketing solution, and distribution channels that help publishers make their business better in terms of top line and more profitable from a bottom-line perspective. And then for booksellers and other channel partners, our goal is to have the largest catalog of meaningful books available in the formats they choose at the speed of supply required by the markets we serve. It's an honor to be speaking with you and I'll be on this panel together, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Molly and Allison.
Excellent, thanks. So just to give everybody an idea of our roadmap for the day, we are going to spend about 45 minutes on discussion, and then we have some audience questions. Thank you to all of those who submitted questions before the event today. If you do have more questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A feature here on the platform. And if we don't get to your question today, someone at Ingram will follow up with an answer. So don't worry if we can't cover it today. We've got lots to talk about. So let's jump right in. So our first question here, what are the primary challenges you see right now in the industry, and what are the drivers? And maybe we'll start, Allison, with you on this question.
Sure. So I am on a break right now from a cross-country tour visiting independent bookstores around the country and attending the Regional Bookseller Association shows. So I've been able to talk to a lot of bookstores for the last week and ongoing. And I would say right now, going into Q4, there are a few primary challenges. None of these will surprise anyone on this call. The first is people power. And I would say that's related to the labor shortage and the Great Resignation. What's a little bit different for independent bookstores when they feel the impact of this is that in many ways, these bookstores are selling goods, right? It's a goods industry. We're selling books. But at the same time, the value proposition of independent bookstores means that we are also a service industry. So having a labor shortage going into Q4 is potentially very harmful for sales because you lose some of that institutional knowledge, the breadth of people's book knowledge and backlist knowledge, and all of those things that are really critical to things like hand selling and that personal customer service. So labor is definitely on people's minds. I think the other is supply chain, which I know is probably a big topic we'll talk about today. Obviously, when publishers are feeling the consequences of supply chain, the bookstores do as well. And I think the bookstores are feeling it very specifically around damages in the industry. This has been a big concern the last couple of years. The percentage of books that arrive damaged to independent bookstores is higher than any of us would want it to be, because that hurts sales and consumes a lot of time in terms of processing it. So those are two of the big challenges right now. I think the third is related to burnout. I think, that's not uncommon right now, coming kind of out of a pandemic. And I think a lot of people are trying to re-energize as we go into this last stretch of the year.
Thanks, Allison. Molly, what about from the publisher side, especially starting Zando? And I know we're going to dig into that, but sort of what are some of the larger challenges you've seen?
I think this isn't new, and I think this is really challenging across the media landscape. One of the signal challenges for any publisher right now is discoverability. How do you connect books you know are worthy to readers you know would love them? And it's something that Zando is absolutely built around intending to address. And I think we're chipping away at it. You're seeing across the media landscape lots of ways of harnessing word of mouth and authenticity and the power of different platforms. And we've had some recent amazing success, which I'm happy to discuss later. That's a key problem. Another problem, I think, is the homogeneity of the workforce around books. I think one really important consideration is diversity, and how do you bring in so many different points of view that can drive readership, drive author support, drive success for the diverse world that we really live in.
Thanks. Phil, what about from the wholesale distribution perspective?
Yeah, I've got a few notes on that. I'm going to read a bit of it because it's such a big question, and I wanted to have a reasonable answer. So our business grew during the toughest days of the pandemic, largely a result of our ability to manage and lead through the forces of supply chain disruption, some issues related to sustainability, changes in marketing, which I think we'll touch on in a moment. And now we've got a new challenge in inflation, which is affecting publishers and booksellers. So here at Ingram, we have the benefit of observing much of our industry from a macro point of view. We see a lot, and hopefully we learn a lot. The primary challenges we see now are the need to, again, rethink, as Molly said, the approaches to getting books into the hands of readers, whether through new supply strategies or big changes in the way that books are marketed to desired reader audiences. This, of course, has implications for how booksellers sell and how publishers publish. Molly and Zando have had some great examples of how the acquisition and marketing landscape has changed and how they've taken advantage of that. And indie stores probably have come the furthest in terms of adaptation to new consumer needs during this period, primarily with regard to book buyer service and marketing strategies. In other words, figuring out how to be direct sellers in one way or the other. We think that some of these challenges are here to stay and are encouraged by the resilience and adaptability of our industry. We are meeting these challenges through past and future investments in manufacturing, inventory solutions tied to expanded domestic and global channels of distribution. If we think about publishing, the thing that they value the most about their relationship with us is access to channels of distribution. And FYI, we're launching a UK wholesale business this month. We're also making big investments in the development of reader direct marketing solutions for all the publishers that we serve. We believe that marketing to readers as an agency, given the ability to specifically target book buyers through their interests, is a place where we can use our scale, systems, and expertise to help publishers sell more books. Finally, it seems to us that booksellers adapted well to these changes in consumer habits, as I mentioned, through direct delivery and other accommodations to pandemic-driven issues. We think that many of these changes, whether on the publisher side or the bookselling side, are persistent, and that some parts of the bookselling model have changed forever, especially when competing in new ways with the past advantages of internet bookselling. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Thank you, Amy.
Bill, I think this is those are great kind of high-level overview, and we're going to kind of start to dig into some areas there. And so for our next question, as we get into more challenging economy, it seems to change by the day, where we're headed that way. I think there's a lot of unknowns out there, unknowns and uncertainty. How can publishers be more efficient, and what does efficiency really look like these days? And Phil, we're going to start with you on this one, and I think you sort of set the stage, and want to hear from you more specifically.
Great. It'll be a shorter answer this time. From our experience observing publishing, but admittedly, we're not a publisher, it seems to us that to the extent publishers can continue to shift SG&A costs, back office, supply chain expenses to book development, editorial, and marketing, then they create better odds of success. This is one of the reasons we see constant industry consolidation. PRH and S&S is a great example, balanced at times by new successful publishing entrants. So it's interesting. As the industry consolidates at the top, more professional new entrants come in to take the place of what traditional publishers or enterprise publishers have done in the past. At the same time, we've seen vast infrastructure consolidation in publishing. This includes printing and warehousing and stuff like that. And it's soon to be true for marketing and marketing spend and services. That'll be the next place where consolidation happens in our industry. So barriers to creating books, just about any book, have fallen, and you can see this in the number of books published annually, but barriers to good editorial, effective marketing, and developing relationships with booksellers and readers remain as high as ever. Booksellers only have so much time to meet with reps, and publishers have huge spend on marketing in order to break through the noise. The question for the publishing industry is, when does spending to achieve scale and back end take away from spending to develop new books and market backlists? I'm sure this is a constant discussion in publishing houses. Where are we going to spend our money, and does it take away from our ability to grow our list? In short, efficiency and long-term viability for publishers means moving spending to book development marketing. The same thinking applies to efficiency for booksellers, and Allison touched on this. To the extent that back office can become front of store, serving more customers, sales will increase. The industry needs to take time and talent out of the back end and put it on the front end. That is easy to say and hard to do, but it's all about revenue generation and how can you get people out of the back end and move them to the front end in a very competitive environment.
I think, Molly, it would be good to hear from you. Phil sort of asked a specific question about, publishers and how you're spending your resources, and especially focused on efficiency and what that means for you as a publisher.
Yeah, I think the large publishers have really challenged themselves to slim down on their services on the back end, and they've optimized incredibly well. But I think in order to support the robust editorial environment, what you're by definition creating is a ton of competition, right? Everybody using the tremendous resources of a large publisher to buy the more obvious books, a lot of them extraordinary, able to scale incredibly well. What I'm sort of curious about is, what can Zando, as an independent player with very clear discipline around platform, partner, and marketing, what can we scale? What interesting books can we scale that large publishers don't see an opportunity for? Where can we create opportunity for those books by, with, as Phil mentioned, a sort of more creative, more vast and robust marketing approach? Like, what is the opportunity for the book that I think I, as a publisher at a large publishing house, might have been concerned about how to succeed with? Honestly, I have to say, I feel like the world's my oyster. With Ingram's support on the back end, with the right amount of resources, the curatorial instincts we have, and the marketing opportunity we have, I feel you may not in the end want to read these books, but I will definitely make you aware of them.
And Allison, what about from the indie side? What are efficiencies looking like these days?
Well, I would very much second what Phil said. I think it's all about identifying inefficiencies in operations, then shifting that back office staff to the front of the sales floor. I think we've been looking a lot at where we can be more efficient in terms of processing things. I think technology has been of great assistance in this way. And I think what's interesting to me, or what strikes me, is how all of these things we've talked about are already tied together, right? So when we're talking about the inefficiencies, when you have a labor shortage, you really need to be as efficient as possible. When you're concerned about discoverability, you really want to shift that payroll to the sales floor where people are hand selling and recommending titles. So, all of these things are so tangled up in many ways, and it's figuring out which lever to push first. but we've certainly seen some progress. I think Batch is an example of a technological platform that helps streamline invoicing for booksellers. That's been, very advantageous to this end. And I think there are others that we're looking at too.
Thanks, Allison. Sort of in line with the same topic. So in challenging times, we see opportunity and innovation emerge oftentimes. And over the last couple of years, we've definitely seen that. So the idea and the question is, and you guys are y'all are getting there. And so I think we just want to kind of dig deeper in this, is how can we reframe all of these current challenges as opportunities? The publishing industry has a traditional history, and a lot of things have worked the way they've worked because they've just always been done that way, is what you might hear. And so how can we challenge the old way of thinking and doing things, and to really bring about change that will stick? So let's start, Molly, with you.
One great frustration I think every publisher faces is how to marry up this love of some excellent output with the noise that disrupts people's ability to hear about it. And publishers really got very comfortable, and I think this is truly an old way feature of the business, of saying to an author, if you don't have an audience, if you don't have a platform, we don't know how to publish you. And one thing we take great pride in is saying to an author, we believe an author should be an author, that we value for the work on the page, for the ideas that you want to communicate. And it's our job as a publisher to create platform opportunity for you. It's not easy, but of course, if you can leverage platforms and partnership and align the values of the content being created by the writer and the values of the platform, we believe there's a force multiplier there, which is unique to Zando's value proposition, but I think is something that publishers any publisher has to figure out. What is the value proposition? How do you drive awareness? I feel like I'm going to be the person who repeats my premise over and over again, because I of course grapple with supply chain, and we're thinking about it all the time, where that efficiency lives. But the thing that will never change, in my view, is the love of a great book. The physical object, I think, is here to stay. I think we all saw moments of profound challenge, the shiny new object, the ebook. I think audiobooks are incredibly powerful and are not going anywhere. But there are just sort of foundational realities to reading books, and those happen to be physical, I think, as much as anything. Really, the questions we have to grapple with are the existential questions about awareness and discoverability. So it's going to be, I think, my oft-repeated frame that if we can rethink how we support authors as a publisher, we can change a lot of things.
And getting to the supply chain here, reframing opportunities and challenging the old way. Phil, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, Amy. And I'm really going to echo what Molly said for a moment. The back end of publishing has always been a bit of a mess, but eventually the back end it'll take care of itself. It has to economically. So, publishing's been around for a long time, and I completely agree that the printed book format is not going anywhere. And we see the ascendance of audiobooks, as Molly mentioned, but also ebooks have arrived at about 20% of the market, and they're staying there. There was a bit of a growth during the pandemic, but it's now reverted to the mean. So 80% of books sold are paperback books and hardcover books, and it's going to stay that way as far as we're concerned. So economically, we talked about consolidation and stuff, that the back end is going to sort itself out. And if companies can't sort out their back end, they'll just go bust or be sold. That's the way the publishing industry works. Now, what's interesting, and to pick up on what Molly said, is that if publishers have access to audiences and develop audiences, then they influence purchase decisions. And now the thing that's changing in the industry is they can also influence where these purchases will be made. So publishers are now in a position to select which channels of distribution they're going to favor, where even in the last 5 or 6 years, their channels of distribution were dictated by the market power of the retail industry. And a lot of that is shifting because audiences are now known and developed by publishers. So for booksellers, it's going to be important to understand that part of their future role will be in audience development, and in some ways supported by publishers. Just as author events were critical in the past, direct outreach to book buyers is going to be important in the future. this understanding of audiences and who owns them is either going to be a partnership between booksellers and publishers, or it's going to be an adversarial relationship. And I can't tell you which, but it's going to be fascinating to watch. So in the long run, the back end is going to take care of itself. It's good old survival of the fittest. And it's unfortunately going to sort itself out through more changes in the industry. But sales and marketing audience development and a shift from the infrastructure changes I talked about is where innovation is going to happen.
And our next question, we're going to jump right into exactly what you're talking about, Phil, the marketing and the role between publishers and booksellers. But before we get in fully shift away from what we're currently talking about, I want to give Allison an opportunity, because I think in some respects, the indie booksellers were maybe some of the most innovative during the last couple of years. So tell us your thoughts there and how you see some of the old ways shifting and changing.
Yeah, I totally agree, Amy. It's been really exciting to see how innovative stores were and all the different ways that they pivoted during the pandemic. And I think the things that we realized as an industry, I mean, number one, how interdependent we all were. And number two, how many assumptions we needed to take a fresh look at. And that's what I saw booksellers doing over and over again. You know, we saw the assumption that it's hard to open an independent bookstore. Well, we saw over 300 independent bookstores open during the pandemic, and ABA's membership increased by 20%. That was something that no one saw coming. I think the assumption has been that if you have a physical bookstore, that it would have 4 walls and a roof. Well, we've seen all kinds of fluidity in terms of formats of stores, from mobile to pop-ups, and all kinds of variations of hybrid models along those lines. So I think there were so many things I saw bookstores do that challenged the assumption around the definition of their role in their community. I mean, I'm thinking of a bookstore in New York that really doubled down on being a community center and did COVID testing and had food for people in the refrigerator out front for those who are experiencing food scarcity, and all of these different things where they really kind of expanded their value proposition. But I think the lessons that came out of that are, what are the assumptions that we still have that we need to be challenging and asking ourselves, how could it be different? How could we make it different? And then also looking at all of us as partners. You know, when you talk about that interdependence that the whole world kind of experienced during the pandemic, I think it's really time for the industry to look at the health of the ecosystem, and that being a shared goal.
Great points. Thanks, Allison. So moving into continuing the same thread, but we're going to shift around to talking a little about marketing. And so through technology, publishers and booksellers know more about their customers than ever in their readers. So Allison, we'll start with you specifically on how the ABA is helping booksellers with marketing in this new sort of consumer data environment where so much is known about consumer purchases and what people are even thinking of purchasing, it seems like.
Yeah, this is such an interesting one for independent booksellers, because as an industry, we've always been known for protecting customer privacy. And so a little bit of what's happened the last few years has been helping stores consider how they can protect consumer privacy and consider how to utilize data that actually helps customers and drives sales. So that's been a lot of ABA's role the last couple of years, is kind of shifting that paradigm for stores. And it's a little bit of a Dorothy moment. I mean, some of this data they've had all along, so it's really bringing that data to their attention. Maybe it's their POS system or things like Above the Tree Line, which is a platform that gives stores a lot of data about which books are selling around the country. So those things, really understanding what's available and how to optimize them, and then recognizing the new data that became available during the pandemic. So some of that is information ABA has, some of it is through Google Analytics, some of it is through things like Bookshop, which has been an incredible platform to help stores identify new independent bookstore customers and find out who those people are, where they're coming from, and how we can meet their needs. So a lot of it has been helping stores optimize, and then also creating a lot of turnkey marketing assets to help reach those customers for stores.
Thanks, Allison. Sort of a second part to this question on the publisher side is Molly. So how are publishers thinking about the balance between traditional promotion and using social media, all of the sort of new ways of reaching readers and customers?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I just wanted to pick up on something that Amy was saying. One thing that's been fascinating about all of these opened bookstores is they also, aside from all the technology that's available to them and the information, I feel like they're being opened around values, around identity, and around community. And that is not something, that's almost like a retro approach to bookselling, right? We saw this rise of chains in the 80s and 90s, and they were sort of serving everybody. I'm really excited by the regionality of these stores and how they supply for their community. And I think we can all sort of really celebrate the way that these stores bring you in your community and in your neighborhood. And that feels very fresh to me. It's the dream we've always had. And certainly when I moved to New York City in the 90s, I definitely was stumbling across independent bookstores all over New York City. And I feel around the country and everywhere the great opportunity for that resurgence represents. So that's very exciting. To me as a publisher. When we were thinking about this question, I was thinking too, what I always knew when we started Zando is that earned media is still enormously valuable. When you have a sort of credible media institution acknowledging and giving serious consideration to something you're publishing, that's very persuasive. It's an independent arbiter. It's somebody who's being paid to be critically thoughtful about a book. It still matters. It says our attention is so fractured. It doesn't have the influence that it once did, but it still matters. What, of course, is enormously powerful now is the micro communities or the mass communities on social media. And the barrier to entry for one influential thinker aligned with a book that feels authentically related to them, the influence and the impact they can have. What I'm finding and what I feel really committed to, and I think this whole company feels committed to, is the inauthentic influence. I think a lot of people want to talk about, let's just align a celebrity, let's pay them something, let's make sure there's an ad tag on their Instagram post and go forth and triumph. But that's not how books work, right? Books are about a deep sense of connection or a set of ideas that change the way that you think. And you can only be persuasive in that modality if the person who's recommending it to you shares that view. So it's all very aligned. It's all very new. I could have a lot of strong opinions before social media, and only the 6 people I talked to about the books or the 20 people in my publishing house cared. And that was a very powerful way to be, right? You felt very much like a gatekeeper, a tastemaker, and you just hoped the world cared. Now what you feel is that this incredibly dynamic consortium of tastemakers. And the very exciting thing to contemplate is like, how do you harness that? What does that mean for an idea set that is in this old mode of the book? And it's we all talk about it all the time in our industry, but like really figuring out how to leverage that new set of community, the new tastemakers with something as complete and excellent as a book is, there's just nothing more exciting to contemplate.
Well, that leads us right into sort of the third part of this is how are those relationships with readers changing as online channels of distribution change?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Sorry, Molly. Yeah. I'll go straight because I think you're heading right there.
So heading there, right? Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking through these questions and I was realizing that on some level, our partners, who include a vast array of platforms and people, although vast array is a little strong, there are a bunch of them. They're almost a new storefront. Right. It is an almost new retail environment. And we are thinking about direct to consumer. We are thinking about the ways in which our partners can directly partner conceivably with booksellers, bookshop.org, anybody who's retailing books. How can they really reach consumers? Because I think that barrier to entry is also much lower. And that's why I think the community exercise of the bookstore is so important. You can't get that from an online transaction. You also can't, it seems to me, get a great recommendation from a very strictly algorithmic recommendation. So like, where's the humanity in this is the one thing. But then that efficiency around the transaction that you're persuaded to make because of an authentic recommendation, that's very exciting too. And that feels very new.
It's interesting to me, and maybe this would be a good time for you to talk about a new title you guys have, because when I think of online channels of distribution, you're also thinking about online channels of reach. And I think this is an interesting story with The Butcher and the Wren. If you could tell us a little about that.
Happy to discuss what is turning out to be a sort of juggernaut for us in our less than 2 years being in business. It's a novel by Elena Urquhart. Elena Urquhart is an amazing storyteller, but she's principally the host of the podcast Morbid, true crime podcast. She discussed true crimes with her old friend and sort of collaborator, Ash. It's hugely popular. I could get this wrong, but I think they've had 200 million downloads of their podcast. Like, there's just no overstating the fan engagement. But Elena's a multi-talented author and is a forensic technician and is really invested in the work she does. And she has written a novel called The Butcher and the Wren. This is a long story that I will try to make short, but I heard about Elena when I was helping Spotify think through their book proposition in the audio space. And when her novel came to us with a different title, we saw the opportunity to support Elena in developing her book and leveraging her extraordinary audience who really believes in her gifts and in what she's communicating, because it feels very aligned with what the podcast was all about. And honestly, once the book was finished and we had our really excellent cover ready, she did a cover reveal on her Instagram and mentioned it on her podcast. And there was a period where we were selling something I think our head of sales was telling us, like a book every 3 seconds for about 3 days. Or at least maybe the first day. We ended up with about 17,000 pre-orders. We drove that. We capitalized on that in different ways of communicating. And by the end of the week, I think we had 43,000 pre-orders. What was interesting about that was the power of Elena's messaging, the fidelity of her fan base, but also that the pre-orders really reached across the spectrum of the retail environment. So I was told, I think, that the bookshop.org was their highest pre-order moment since inception of the platform. Of course, Amazon was really powerful, but Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, everywhere books are sold profited from her announcement. And it really just shows you where the ease is, certainly for consumers, but people buy things in all sorts of ways, especially at scale. And I should say, incredibly grateful to Ingram for meeting us and helping us in this moment with this extraordinary laydown that we were then able to effect with our on sale just yesterday.
That's great. We're really excited about that. Phil, I want to push this question to you. From your perspective with the distribution business and with the new consumer marketing services, how do you see the relationships changing? I think you're muted, Phil.
Rookie mistake. I think I covered a little bit of that in prior answers. I think what's going to happen is there'll be certain companies in the industry where scale matters, and there'll be other companies primarily on the content side and the book selling side where scale doesn't necessarily matter. And to expand on that a bit, warehouses are becoming automated. Manufacturing is becoming, in lights out warehouses. There's a lot going on with scale economies in the back end of the book business. New York Times yesterday had an article on automated trucking going up and down the highways. Very difficult to replicate that if you don't have scale. And so there'll be a few companies that have very large scale in the industry that end up being service companies to an industry where on the publishing side, the barriers to entry to creating books are quite low. The barriers to selling books are actually quite high. And what I mean by that is editorial, it's easy to get a book. It's hard to have good editorial. It's easy to have an author. It's hard to have an author who can help or who's marketable. All of those things are going to be the purview of the publishing companies, which is how do you find content that's worthy of putting into the supply chain? On the book selling side, what's fascinating to us, as Allison said, is we saw more independent bookstores open in the last year than we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years. And I don't know what the number is, but it goes way back. What that means to me is that booksellers are adapting, and they're figuring out how to reach an audience that heretofore to them may have been unreachable. So in some parts of the industry, there's this expansion of opportunity in terms of the falling of barriers to entry and the understanding of audience. In other parts of our industry, there are places where scale is going to matter, and if you're not participating in that scale, you won't be able to take advantages of the advantages that you have as a publisher or a bookseller.
Thanks, Phil. We're going to move on to you, Molly, and we have a couple of questions, and I'll kind of combine them because we're having such great discussions here, and I want to make sure we cover a lot of the other content that we have queued up. But so Zando has a unique business model. You've talked about it and given some examples. Tell us a little about the challenges and how going on in the industry and how you guys are helping authors be more successful. And also sort of the second part of that are as you were starting up, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced, and what would you advice would you give to emerging publishers out there?
Yeah, I'll take the starting question first. Capital. I think raising, and one thing I was really careful about was building out a business plan I felt was legitimately reflected what is unavoidable about publishing, right? Physical production, advances, if you want to compete. And this is, the subject of much legal discussion over the last few months, being competitive in the content space, but really believing also in your editorial point of view that you could choose well. And my husband always says to me, you find the things under the rock, which is certainly a point of pride. But having the right capital, having a board, and not everybody who starts a publishing house needs to do it as ambitiously as I did, which was required a great deal of resources, but wanting a board who also valued what I was trying to do. They're book readers, they're writers, they're creators, and they understood the value of the book, and they understood the challenge that the industry was undergoing, and that I, in a very specific way, was trying to address those challenges. So they kind of believed. And as a sole founder, I found that incredible to have a support group. It doesn't have to look like a fancy board, but to have a support group who believes in your mission. I think all of us can say this in our lives is critically important. What was the second question you asked me? There was the startup piece of it, and then there was something else.
Yeah. So the second question is sort of what challenges you faced and what advice you would give to a publisher, a new indie publisher wanting to launch.
I think you have to have a point of view, and you have to be really thinking the value proposition of what you're publishing. If you, I really believe in like incredibly siloed and specific editorial tastes. One thing that which is a weird thing to say to be someone who's known as like a general publisher, but I think a specific expertise is really important. So if you were going to publish books just about crochet, you should be really good at it. You should really understand the market. You should understand the audience. You should understand why somebody's great at it and what's differentiating about your offering. For the way I apply that thinking is with our partners. I'm really committed with partners like Get Lifted and John Legend and Sarah Jessica Parker and Gillian Flynn and Crooked Media, to name a few of them, really protecting their lanes, their content lanes. What are their interests? What is their mission? How does the book that we want to support align with their identity and their visibility and their power in the world? Because that is where we all succeed. Right? A book is an enormously additive offering for any media platform, but it has to be meaningful for the author as well. So that is difficult, right? Is like protecting those lanes, choosing partners who I use this sort of Ghostbusters lane. I've been very afraid of the line from Ghostbusters. Crossing the streams is very stressful. You want it to be clear, ideally, that this is a Gillian Flynn novel, and her first book is coming out in February. It's a perfect Gillian Flynn novel. I don't have another partner who would publish Scorched Grace better than she would, and that I think is very powerful to build up identity. But it's hard, and I think you have to be disciplined. Books come up for us that our editorial team, who are enormously experienced and very excellent, just love, and we just want to publish. And we try very hard to think about, do we have the partner? If we don't have the partner, if it doesn't fit a list we have, should we really be applying our resources to acquiring it? And sometimes we do, but we think very hard about it, and it's a robust debate. I think being disciplined about your business model, I think about being having an incredibly detailed and business plan where you're being honest with yourself. There are costs associated with publishing that nobody would start a business around today. And being really honest with my board and my funders and saying, these are unavoidable cost elements of the business. Like, this is just a fact of the business, but people read books. It is an evergreen business. It's billions of dollars of consumer capital is devoted to acquiring books. If you trust me, even though I'm acknowledging the cost associated, with creating these things, if you trust me, it can be enormously successful and popular. And again, we're taking a pretty ambitious big swing. I don't think that has to apply to everybody who's interested in publishing. I think with the kind of back-end opportunity that Phil was talking about, if you have a vision and an expertise and access to creative talent, I think many people can be successful publishers. You just have to know which levers to pull and how much capital you need to do it.
Great advice. Thanks, Molly. We're going to move in to a topic that has been very much a part of our industry over the last several years. When it comes to emerging voices and clearing the slate for new authors, what can publishers and booksellers do to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? And Allison, I'm going to start with you because I know this has been a very important topic for the ABA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is, going back to what I said earlier about thinking about the health of the entire kind of book ecosystem. I think this is one of the most important things we could be talking about. I think from an ethical perspective, but also from a business perspective. And I think Molly touched on that really well earlier about just how important this is. And one of the things that we've seen the last few years is tremendous progress as an industry to this end. And we have a long, long way to go as well. So it is definitely a journey. There's some publishers doing some great things right now, and we're very appreciative of that. From ABA's perspective, we continue to try to create programs that will help both publishers and bookstores work on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Independent bookstores have regularly celebrated and centered debut authors and historically marginalized voices, but we all kind of need to do our part to help support that work. So ABA has a couple of initiatives that work with bookstores and publishers. One is an advanced access program for underrepresented voices. So publishers can get those books in front of booksellers and help them promote them and fall in love with them. And we also have a program called Indies Introduced, which we just announced the new list last week. And this is a twice-a-year program to introduce people to new voices, which sometimes are historically marginalized voices, but it's an amazing list of titles that are selected by independent booksellers around the country. And this is a way that publishers can find an audience within bookstores for these authors, for these diverse voices, and then the bookstores can get out there and spread the word. So I think those are some of the things that we've been doing that I'd mention. And then I think one of the most important things for all of us, for each of our groups, whether it's a publisher or a bookseller, is to think about representation within our own organizations. Because if we don't reflect the customers we're trying to support or the voices we're trying to represent, then we are failing. So I think the more we can do to really make sure that we are representative of the world that we serve, the better we all are.
Thanks, Allison. Molly, how are you guys approaching this topic at Zando?
Yeah, it's critical to everything we do. I think we're at a generational transformation of book publishing, and we have to be. And I don't think, if I'm honest, I don't think you can do it from a big existing organization quickly. You need expertise, you need long experience, and you need relationships. So really what we have to do is develop the next generation of talent. And that is something we have to invest in as a company. It's incredibly important for the partners that we work with, who are central to the culture in the United States, see a company reflected back at them that is supporting the work and the books that they want to champion. And from the author and acquisition side, I feel really strongly, we talk about this all the time, publishers look at a previously published author and they think track is terrible. No bookseller will take these books. We're investing money in a lost cause, and where's the shiny new object? Where's the debut? And I trained myself to think that way for my own generation of publishing. And we are being really disciplined about ignoring track, judging a book on its bona fides and its excellence, regardless of how the audience failed to understand it at the time, because the gatekeepers were all white, didn't know how to reach an audience, a diverse audience. We are committed to rethinking the proposition that a book offers, because the world is, I think, has to be given an incredible range of content to choose from. And then you as a publisher have to believe as ambitiously as possible with very high expectations that you can find the audience that's intended for it. And I think that's about breaking new ground, but I think it's about reflecting the world as it is, as President Obama famously said. That is really what we as a publisher have built, is our foundation, and not receiving conventional wisdom about assuming that certain audiences are siloed or aren't interested in books. Sort of a lot of racist claptrap around that has to be absolutely shown the door, and really digging into audiences with our partners and finding the books that an incredible array of readers want to read is just our task. And we're very committed to it.
Thanks, Molly. I think this will be a topic that we're all going to be talking about and wrestling with for a while to come, and rightly so, because we are into our last 14 minutes. I'm going to keep moving us forward, and we're going to talk about sort of going into Q4, and 2023 is going to be here before we know it, crazily enough. And so, Phil, I'm going to start with you on this one. What should publishers be thinking about, here in September of 2022?
Yeah, so I'll share some good news first. So we expect, again, from our ability to observe the industry, a pretty good fall and holiday season. We think it'll exceed our experience in 2019, but be slightly below the industry's 2021 experience. And if you get NPD or Nielsen information, it concurs with that opinion. And we're seeing that in order patterns and stuff like that now. What we're learning is the book industry does indeed compete for entertainment and discretionary dollars when there's not, or when the pandemic was at its height, versus when the pandemic was at its height. So, but we expect this competition loss to the book business to be in single digits from a percentage basis. So in other words, there are going to be a lot of bestsellers and there's going to be a lot of business in this quarter. It just won't be to the extent that it was at the height of stay at home. We do expect continued supply chain challenges, some self-inflicted, like the current threat of a railroad strike. That'll make a difference, but also due to vestigial supply chain cleanups from the peak of the pandemic. Finally, we think the season is going to lean towards a consumer direct holiday. And why is that? It's not necessarily because consumers will stay home, but because not all the books are where they should be to support consumers' purchasing desire. The supply chain remains messed up. This favors consumer direct and dropship sales. I would have to point out the indies did a great job at dropship sales. I'm hopeful that they'll keep their mojo on all that. Looking beyond Q4, I'll just emphasize what we've already mentioned. There'll be a shift to editorial and marketing spend from fixed cost spending at publishers. That's all going to happen early next year. And ultimately, that's going to drive more demand for books. I actually think one of the reasons we haven't reverted to the 2019 mean in the book industry is we've become better booksellers and we've become better marketers.
Thanks, Phil. Allison, from your perspective, what should publishers be thinking about?
I think we've touched on some of it. I want to say I tend to agree with Phil's overall assessment of where we'll be this holiday season, though I'm going to be a little more optimistic and say maybe we could actually beat those numbers. But I think it is going to be a good season. And I think for publishers, going back to everything we talked about, really understanding that independent bookstores as a channel will be challenged in a unique way that can impact sales. So when we go back to that labor shortage thought and the significant number of stores that have seen turnover where they're now looking at a sales staff that may have been there less than 6 months going into the holiday season. So publishers really creating relationships through their reps with booksellers to help increase their book knowledge going into the holidays and really bringing things to their attention directly will go a long way. And then I think, again, we're back to addressing some of the inefficiencies, whatever we can do to really help with that going into this final stretch, whether it be utilizing technology and portals that help us process returns and damages and things of that nature. Ingram has a great portal that helps stores in a lot of ways be more efficient, really making sure that everybody has the tools and the knowledge about the tools going into this stretch so we can be as efficient and as effective as possible.
Thanks, Allison. And Molly, as a publisher, what are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about proving my premise. I think 2023 is a real proof of concept year. We've had some sort of unexpected success in our first year of publishing that I'm incredibly thrilled about. But really, I've been looking toward to 2023 and thinking about how do we enable Gillian Flynn to be the most effective publisher she can be? How do we harness Get Lifted and John Legend to be as persuasive with readers, and how do we leverage the power of booksellers in that? How do we create a three-legged stool? On some level, we are layering on a new sort of layer of publishing, of marketing complexity, but I'm hoping it'll pay enormous dividends. But we're teaching people how to be publishers, and we're creating a competency inside our own company to enable them to be publishers. And like at every level, though we're a book publisher and that's the oldest business, we're doing it in the newest way. And so I'm hopeful and that we are figuring it out. I certainly owe it to our authors and I owe it to our partners to do so. And if we can prove our premise, I think the things that we can build from there are, the sky's the limit, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which is to say, by supporting independent booksellers, by helping to build community, even if it's a robust and massively scaled community on social media, whatever that looks like. There are a lot of great things. And I'm hopeful that over the course of 2023, that what we've bet on and how we're betting on it will actually work. But, I'll get a job if it doesn't. It'll be fine.
Well, that kind of leads us, I'm going to skip one question because Allison, I think you've talked a little about booksellers and technology, but I want to go right in because I think it is pertinent to what Molly was just saying. Allison, what are the top things that publishers can do to make sure indies are remaining vibrant and that their success and the growth that we've seen continues?
I think we've touched on so many of the things. One thing that comes to mind is, again, going back to what assumptions we need to challenge at this point and helping publishers understand that there are a lot of small but mighty bookstores out there, and there are a lot of bookstores kind of challenging everyone's assumptions on what it means to be a bookstore and making sure we're supporting these new non-traditional formats and things of that nature. I think that's a huge thing for us all to understand that this is the future. We have fluidity throughout the environment in a way we've never had before, and representing that can be understanding that can be very exciting, and figuring out ways to really partner with stores to optimize that flexibility that it represents and the ways that it is connecting readers in kind of a new, exciting way. We're coming off of this renaissance in reading that happened during the pandemic, and we all as an industry have to figure out how to keep that momentum going. And I think Molly touched on some really exciting ways to think about that. And I think publishers seeing themselves as partners with booksellers to that end will go a long way.
Thanks, Allison. So one of the things that I believe, Allison, you definitely touched on in the first question about challenges is sort of the workforce and what that looks like now. And so you touched on it, and I don't know if you want to, we'll start with you to add of what does that future workforce and hiring market look like in publishing from a bookselling perspective? And then we'll move on to you, Molly, and to you, Phil, on this question.
It's interesting. I think we're still figuring it out. I mean, it's been interesting talking to bookstores who are figuring out how to help some of their staff work remotely. That's another assumption, right? That of course you have to be in the bookstore to be working at a bookstore, but that's one of the ways that we've changed the way we're looking at that. I think the one thing I would say across the board for bookstores and publishers, that the industry as a whole has to make a priority, and everything we talked about kind of supports us doing so, is livable wage. And that's livable wage for people in publishing, in bookselling, bookstore owners. That's every aspect of this ecosystem. And the more efficient we are, the more effective we are at driving sales, at creating discoverability. I mean, all of those things will support that. And I think that's kind of the underlying critical piece of this, talking about the labor shortage and the workforce and hiring market.
Thanks, Allison. Molly, what are your thoughts on what it looks like going forward?
Thank you for asking that. Actually, the thing I forgot to mention is the livable wage question. It's the obligation of the publisher who wants to reflect the world as it is to pay people so they can support themselves doing this work. But as I've said before, and as everyone knows, the margins in publishing are so thin that your obligation as a publisher is not just to hire and support your workers who are interesting, well-rounded, diverse people, but to publish more effectively. I think there's this, you can do that if you have the revenue to support it. And so it's this delicate dance between your vision for what you want your company to be and how you want it to reflect the world, but also making the business as powerful and impactful and as successful financially as you can in order to support that effort. So I feel, as much as it's my obligation to build a company that reflects the world, it's also my obligation to succeed, because you can't pay anybody if you can't. So it is a vicious and possibly beautiful cycle, but I think both things are critically important.
Thanks, Molly. Phil, what are your thoughts on how you see the workforce?
Well, we did a pretty good job moving to fully remote for our office professionals during the pandemic. So we, on a Monday, everyone brought their computer home and we were up and running, which meant that, we were probably running the company okay to be able to do that. We were grateful for the 3,000 employees we had who didn't have an opportunity to have a flexible work schedule or a work from home schedule. These are our manufacturing and distribution folks, and they were the engine that kept the supply chain going during the pandemic. So we're grateful for those folks. The thing that we're struggling with now is we were slower in innovation and the execution of new ideas during the pandemic. We were high on flexibility and low on innovation. And the question now for us, the existential question is, how do we keep the values that we created with a flexible work schedule, but also increase the pace of collaboration and innovation? And to Molly's point, we've got to be able to keep up with the industry or we won't be relevant. And so that's what we're struggling with right now, which is how can we make better tools? How can we move faster? How can we do a better job if we're going to be one of the scale solutions for the industry? So that's what we're thinking about now.
Thanks, Phil. So we've come to the end of our questions. We did get some really great audience questions, but I know we have an hour here, and so we want to wrap up. We will reach out to the audience and to those who submitted questions and get some answers to you guys. Thank you for participating and by sending questions. I want to thank each of our panelists, Phil, Molly, and Allison. Really great perspectives, lots of information and ideas to think about. I really like that this panel is reflective of the collaboration across the supply chain. I mean, I think this is what it's going to take to continue to be successful, all of us going into the future. So appreciate you joining us today. And to our audience members, thank you guys for joining us, and continued programming with our Publisher Insights with Ingram, I'm sure will be planned. So stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks.